10 July 1741. Edward. Handel says he will do nothing next winter. I hope I shall persuade him to set another scripture collection I have made for him and perform it for his own benefit in Passion Week. Hope he will lay out his whole genius and skill upon it, that the composition may excel all his former compositions, as the subject excels every other subject. The subject is Messiah. And the rest, as they say, is history. 250 years after the first performance, Handel's Messiah is still in the top 10 of popular classics. Currently, in the United Kingdom CD catalogue, there are 28 complete versions of the work. Despite the resurgence of his operas, Handel is remembered principally by most people as a composer of English oratorios. And Messiah remains his best-known work. He was an entrepreneur as well as a composer, a very theatrical man, a very public man. Yet his private life stayed firmly behind the doors of his Brook Street house in London.
The trouble with our knowledge about what Handel was like as a human being is, I think, because most of the eyewitness reports we've had were by people who knew him towards the end of his life, like Charles Burney, the great English musicologist and composer and writer. And he gave us a marvelous description of Handel, saying that in repose his face was rather severe and even had a slightly sour expression. But the minute he talked, it became animated and as if it were illuminated by an inner light. And he also said something, that he had a famous temper. He swore in 5 languages, and it was, but it was very funny, except to the person who was being sworn at, all this goings on in 5 languages. And he said there was something that was very touching about it. It was never nasty, and there was nothing malign about it, nothing vicious about Handel at all. But one of the things that makes it difficult for us is that Handel was larger than life. He was a great, huge man. He was twice my size, and I mean twice this size, and he ate huge amounts of food. There's a story that he once ordered from his cook a dinner for 7. Finally, they said, "Where's the company?" He said, "I am the company." And of course, he was always drinking huge quantities of wine and huge quantities of anything. But there's something as large as life about his music, too. It's very big-time music.
Born in Halle, Germany in 1685, Handel became a naturalized British subject by royal decree in 1727. But his first visit to England was in 1710. He was an immediate success, and this was to continue for the next 2 decades.
One has to say about taste in London that it was largely determined by Handel when he arrived there from the continent and put on Rinaldo with its 4 trumpets and with the flights of doves that were let out over the stage, and it conquered the town overnight. Well, by 1730s, opera had become a major factor in English life, Italian opera, of course. Now, opera as a genre has more pitfalls than any other genre alike. You can have the most incredible success on Monday, and by Friday you go out. Nobody quite understands why this should be so, but it is so. And the classic case is, of course, Handel himself. From starting his operatic life in London with literally a big bang, never mind the 4 trumpets, but everything else, at the end of his operatic life, Handel's operas were playing to empty houses. And there's this description of Handel sitting in the rival opera house in solitary splendor, watching, as it were, the downfall of his enemy, but his own downfall had just happened too. And he wouldn't take no for an answer. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. And being a stubborn old Saxon, he didn't want to give up. He kept trying to ram his operas down the throats of the London public. And finally, people even wrote in public letters and said, "Please write in English, please write on the Bible, use the text of the Bible." He wouldn't do it.
The spring of 1741 found Handel overworked and deeply depressed. His latest opera, De Dame, had only managed 3 performances that January. Unsure of the future in London, he was contemplating returning to his native Germany. The change in his fortunes was not only the arrival of Charles Jennings' words for a new oratorio, but also an invitation to go to Dublin. The Duke of Devonshire, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, suggested to Handel that he direct a number of concerts on behalf of 3 Irish charities in the forthcoming season. Dublin was a flourishing cultural and musical city. For Handel, it was a new springboard for his compositions, and conveniently would take him away from London. With renewed vigour, Handel started work on Messiah. With Dublin as a possible first performance, he wrote with white-heat intensity. The entire oratorio was completed in 24 days, from the 22nd of August to the 14th of September. Some of the music was adapted from earlier works, but even so, it was an amazing achievement. Handel arrived in Dublin on the 18th of November and took up residence in Abbey Street. The first 2 series of concerts at the new music hall in Fishamble Street were sold out and a great success. Messiah was announced for the 12th of April. In fact, it was postponed by a day to the 13th. Tickets were half a guinea each, and entry to the rehearsal would be free with a performance payment. The rehearsal was so well attended that to fit more people into the hall for the performance, ladies were asked not to wear hoops to their dresses and gentlemen to leave their swords at home. In the event, 700 were crammed into a hall with an official capacity for 600. Handel directed the performance from the organ.
When Handel arrived and decided to do Messiah in a public house with the scriptures, being a Catholic country, they didn't see anything extraordinary about this at all. After all, they did masses every single Sunday with words like this, sung, and well, no problem. So they took it for what it was, and since they were very clever, and since the Irish have always loved music, they saw right away that it was a marvelous masterpiece, and it was in, no problem. Hardly had Handel taken that Messiah back to England, he was in trouble. They immediately started to write open letters. You couldn't do this kind of a thing in an opera house. And there's a story about Mrs. Siva, who sang the alto part in the Messiah, that the first performance, a priest said, "For this thy sins be forgiven, woman." It's a terrible Protestant thing, this. There was a Protestant priest who said this. But this is typical of the attitude in those days, that these singers were licentious characters, and what business could they have possibly had singing the words of the scripture?
The first performance in England was at Covent Garden in 1743. 2 years later, it was revived at the King's Theatre. Again, the work was very coolly received. There was even talk of banning performances. The real breakthrough came in 1750, when Handel, ever the pragmatist, organised the work for charity. A performance was to be given at the Foundling Hospital for the maintenance and education of exposed and deserted children. The hospital was founded in 1740 by Captain Thomas Coram. Handel had already given a benefit concert, which included the firework music, in 1749. Now, a year later, he repeated the success of Dublin. No one could object to a sacred piece being performed for charity. It was such a success that the audience overflowed, and a second performance had to be given. From this point, Messiah was firmly established. It was performed every year at the hospital during Handel's lifetime. But the arrogant Jennings did not approve. After the first English performance, he wrote, "His Messiah has disappointed me, being set in great haste, though he said he would be a year about it and make it the best of all his compositions. I shall put no more sacred works into his hands, to be thus abused."